Let me tell you a story, dear friends, called The Tale of Tales. This is a story about a time long, long ago when the world was new. Back in the days when the whole world sat in the middle of a great blue bowl on the back of a giant turtle. Now, the world in those days was a very different place than the world today. Back then, all the people in the world lived together. They all lived together in one giant tree near the edge of the top of a great, huge cliff. And also, people then were very different from people today. For one thing, they had not yet learned how to speak. Oh, they could dance and play and hunt and eat and climb up and down their giant tree. They could even sing melodies to make music with their voices. But they had no words, so they could not speak. Also, back then, people had tails. They had long tails and short tails. Some had fat tails. Some had skinny tails. There were tails that were hairy and tails that were smooth, tails that were kinky and tails that were straight. And every person in the world had a tail all their own. And there's another thing that was very different back then. In those days, there were a great many dragons in the world. But like the people, the dragons back then were very different from the dragons we might hear about today. They were not those graceful, gossamer-winged creatures that go gliding by through the midsummer sky. Oh no, not at all. Back then, dragons were fat, clumsy, lumbering creatures with tiny little wings that were useless for flying. They were only good for brushing flies off their backs in the summertime. Those dragons would just go galumphing around the countryside, breathing fire, trying to scare whomever they might meet, and maybe turn them into something tasty to eat. But the dragons in those days were not very smart. In fact, they were so small of brain that those dragons almost never had an original thought of their own. So any time those dragons wanted to decide what to do next, they would have to look around to see what everybody else was doing. And then they would do that, whatever that was. But every time those dragons started doing something, they would have a terrible time stopping doing it. They would just keep on doing the very same thing for a very, very long time. And this was a very lucky thing for all the people in the world. It kept them safe from dragons. You see, the people had a trick to play on the dragons that would keep the dragons away from their tree. When any dragon would come near, breathing fire and acting scary, all the people in the world would run together towards that huge cliff. And when the dragons would see all the people doing that, they too would run towards the cliff. They just couldn't help themselves. And then all the people together would stop very suddenly, right at the edge of the cliff. But the dragons could not stop. They would just keep right on running right over the edge of the cliff. They would bounce and tumble and tumble and bounce all the way down, down, down the side of that cliff and get to the bottom all battered and bruised. And then they would wander away in a daze. After falling over that cliff quite a few times and not enjoying it one little bit, all the dragons in the world decided to stay away from all the people in the world and just leave them alone. Except for one dragon, that is.